Hello, and welcome to the February edition of the Redaction Report show. As you'll see throughout the course of this show, we have recorded this over the course of several days. So if you see a different background in the course of recording proceedings, that's the reason why. Today is actually the last segment we're shooting, though, because we're dealing with very much an ongoing situation. That is Russia's recent incursion into Ukrainian territory. At time of recording, Vladimir Putin has ordered Russian troops into the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, which he has recognized as independent nations. This, of course, follows 8 years ago from the Russian annexation of the Crimea. And here to help us understand this rapidly unfolding situation is Redaction's good friend, Declan Carey, who has himself spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. Declan, how's it going?
Not bad, thanks, James. Yeah, tough few days for me personally, but yeah, happy to share some thoughts tonight anyway. How are you doing?
Not too bad at all. So, Ukraine. Do you want to help us understand a bit of background here? We've talked about this on a previous podcast already, but let's have a look at the Donbass specifically. Why is Vladimir Putin targeting these regions in particular at the moment?
Yeah, these are the historically Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine with big populations of Russian speakers. If you looked at a map of Ukraine, you'd sort of look at it's a huge country, but the sort of central region and the western region typically have had more Ukrainian speakers just historically, whereas the east and the south, so places like Donetsk, like Odessa, have always had more Russian speakers. So it's an obvious place for Vladimir Putin and for Russia to target because, to put it simply, he's probably more likely to find support there than in places like Lviv and Kiev, which have a much stronger connection to the sort of national identity of Ukraine just through the language.
Of course, we saw Vladimir Putin give quite a rambling speech the other day, in which he more or less insinuated that Ukraine, to put it bluntly, has no right to self-determination, is what he insinuated. Could you explain to us a bit of the history behind the relations between Russia and Ukraine? Because I know there is a lot of difficult history between the two. Could you expand on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, come at it from that angle, but I can only share my experience and what I know, having visited it, having friends there. So divided among, let's say, big empires throughout its history. So, many hundreds of years ago, it was part of a place called Kiev Rus, which was kind of a huge region which expanded across Russia and modern Ukraine today. It's been part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at certain stages of its existence, perhaps not the whole country, but certainly many parts in the West. It's been part of Poland. It's been part of the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. I've seen these places myself. If you go to the Carpathian Mountains in Ukraine, you can go to places and people will still tell you that, this road was built by people from the Czech Republic. This town was built by, Austro-Hungarians. So it's been part of many different empires throughout history. Now, what Putin claimed in his kind of deranged speech, which basically sought to change the history of what it is, said that Ukraine is a product only of the Soviet Union, and that's just not true. It's a much wider thing than that. It's always had its own identity. It's always had its own Ukrainian people there. They haven't always been called Ukrainian, but they've always been there. It has been part of the Russian Empire. It had been part of the Russian Empire for a long time, had been part of the Soviet Union, of course. But again, that was never a harmonious move for Ukraine. You only have to look at some of the key events like the Holodomor, which was a man-made famine in Soviet Russia, in the Soviet Union, I should say, which hit Ukraine really hard and was in some ways completely avoidable. Many sources put it down to Stalin's agricultural policy of collectivism, which basically completely changed the landowners of agriculture in Ukraine, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a massive farming and agriculture country. It produces massive amounts of wheat and food. That's obviously why you have the blue sky and the wheat in the Ukrainian flag, the blue and the yellow. So anyway, in the 1930s, when this happened, the food was taken away from Ukraine and people starved essentially, while it was moved to areas where it was deemed to be more needed in the Soviet Union. So look, there's always been an uncomfortable relationship between Ukraine and Russia, whether it was part of the Soviet Union or, obviously since it hasn't been then. So, you touched on Putin's speech. It's just deranged. It's just a false narrative, and it's just a way, an excuse really to justify his invasion, which, gladly has been ridiculed around the world.
Declan, thanks very much for joining us. We'll be keeping you fully updated on the situation in Ukraine over the coming weeks and months, and I'm sure Declan will be joining us in the due course and in the future to discuss the situation as it unfolds. Welcome back. And now it's February 2022, which means it's now been just over 2 years since the UK formally left the European Union. And what a 2 years it's been. We'll dive straight in, shall we? I'm joined for this segment by Richard Hewison, who's the leader of the Rejoin EU Party, and we're going to be talking about 2 years of Brexit. Richard, how's it going? Yeah, 2 years now. Where's all that time gone?
Well, it is and it isn't, isn't it? Because I remember we were supposed to get Brexit done 2 years ago in January, and we got a halfway Brexit for the first year. Then we got a fuller Brexit for the second year, and now we've got a few more things in phase, and we're still waiting until July this year to actually get the full impact of the import checks and quotas in place. When is Brexit ever going to get done? I think is the question.
Well, isn't it until next year that we still have the CE stamps on electronic goods and stuff, and then we get the the crown stamp back on the pint glass and.
Well, do you know what? The crowns on the pint glass, we could have had them since 1980 if we wanted to. That's nothing to do with our EU membership. That's just a bit of a smokescreen, I think, that one.
Well, yes, I mean, flat out fake news. Let's face it. We could have had it there if we wanted to, but so long as you had to have the CE.
That
one
is
as
certainly
well.
something we've seen a boost to since Brexit. 2 years, and I think the fake news is getting better and better in terms of its ability to fool us.
What have you made of that? Because, of course, in 2016, one of the two big promises of the Leave campaign were 350 million on the side of a bus, and Turkey was the other big one. I don't know if you've seen the film Brexit, the Uncivil War with Benedict Cumberbatch as Dominic Cummings, and him just saying in the middle of the campaign, right, keep hammering it home, 350 million in Turkey, 350 million in Turkey. Yeah. And that seems to be more or less the start and end of the Leave campaign back in 2016, didn't it?
Yes. And I think if we look back retrospectively, perhaps the biggest disappointment there is of that is not so much how people voted in the end, but the fact that people believed it, and the fact that the mainstream media didn't debunk that for us. And I think a lot of the problems we've seen with the mainstream media ever since then have been this complete confusion over how to balance the debate. The idea of, do you balance the debate by treating lies equally with treating the truth? Or do you balance the debate by saying, right, we had a vote for Brexit, so we're now no longer going to talk to anyone who doesn't believe in having Brexit? And I think there's been some very disturbing developments in journalism. And I don't blame a lot of the mainstream journalists. I think these are uncharted times, and I think people have made quite a few bad calls over the period.
I think there's probably some truth in that. I think there's a lot of, speaking as a journalist, I think, there's a lot of misguided both sidesism that sometimes happens in journalism, not just on Brexit, but in a lot of topics. I could launch into a whole podcast segment on other topics which get wrongfully both-sided, but yeah, Brexit's definitely one for sure. And just how, a lot of the misinformation was challenged at the time. Let's be real. There were some journalists who were genuinely challenging that 350 statistic.
Yes.
But why didn't it cut through? That's the big question.
The reason it didn't cut through is because when a lot of journalists were challenging it this way, I think it was almost tongue-in-cheek. It was almost like, we know our audience don't believe this. Yeah, 350 million a week. Oh, that's ridiculous. Turkey, never going to join the EU. It was sort of smile on our face. We know you're not believing this. Whereas in actual fact, many, many people were believing it. And I think there was a failure on behalf of quite a lot of people in the journalism industry to actually realize that it wasn't their message that was getting through, and that disinformation was wedging itself much firmer than people expected. And don't forget, at the time of the Brexit vote, we didn't even have Donald Trump at that stage, and all the fake news media that we saw in the US. You could almost say that Brexit in 2016 was almost a pilot project in terms of disinformation from the presidential election that came up later on in that year.
I mean, Donald Trump was accidentally right about quite a lot of things. And I just remember one interview about in early 2016 when he was asked, what do you think about Brexit? And he's like, something along the lines of, yeah, Brexit, I think Britain will vote to leave, yeah. It's like, he was accidentally right about that for some reason. You know, obviously, you know, there are a lot of parallels between what led to Trump and what led to Brexit. You know, that's fairly well documented.
So. Very much so.
There was an extent to which Trump was well aware of what he was tapping into there.
Perhaps if we wind back to early 2016, and if you credit Trump with being aware and in control of his campaign and what he was doing that year, then he would have been well aware of the sort of power of the information services he had in front of him. And don't forget, he was exploiting social media at that stage in a way that many of us didn't even think possible at the time. So
absolutely,
he may even have known what he was talking about for once.
God forbid. I mean, I don't think he got entirely what the situation in Britain was on the ground. I remember him tweeting he was coming to Scotland on the day of the result and him saying, oh, everyone here is going wild about the result. It's like, Donald, Scotland voted to remain. Like,
yeah, within his particular compound of people, I could imagine that would be the case. But I don't think Scotland was a very happy place the day after the referendum, I have to say.
No, for sure. But no, speaking of which, where were you on the day? How did you find out?
Well, I was sat in front of the TV from 10 p.m. watching the results through the night on the night of the referendum. I suppose the first time I worried was, I don't know if you remember that day, but London had one of the nastiest storms of the summer there. It was hail, it was rain.
I wasn't living in London at the time of the referendum, so yeah, I must have missed that.
Nice, bright sunshine, and I was. Oh no! Does this mean people were voting in London? I thought, oh, that's not going to. It didn't have an effect really, but it was a sign. And then of course,
sorry,
I remember Nigel Farage's concession speech at 10 o'clock, which was great. He told us how Brexit had been lost, but never mind, they were going to carry on and carry on and carry on, which is obviously great now because it justifies our side of the campaign, carrying on and carrying on. I also remember how the statistics moved throughout the night, because I was keeping a constant monitor on statistics such as the exchange rate and the spread betting on the probability. And by about 10:30, I recall clearly the spread betting reaching a 93% chance that we would stay in the EU, and at the same time, the pound just going over the 150 mark. And then, of course, crashing back to 120 by the time the result was clear later on in the night. So a 20% devaluation in our currency over a period of 2 hours. That was pretty huge, yeah. Even Harold Wilson didn't manage that in the 60s.
Yeah.
So, so yes, it was quite a night of drama.
That was for sure. I mean, I remember, tragically, I went to bed that night. I was living in Manchester at the time, and it was actually a relatively lovely day there. Went to the polls, did my bit. That was actually, because ever since then I've always had a postal vote. So that's actually the last time I went to a polling station as of today.
Oh, really?
So yeah, went there, lovely day. I stayed up for a bit. I saw the Farage concession speech. But then, I was actually one of the few people who called it that Leave would win, even though I voted Remain myself.
Oh, really? Really?
Yeah. And seeing the results coming in, like them saying, oh, the Leave constituencies are voting Leave by more than they were expected, and the Remain constituencies are winning by less than we were expecting. I thought, okay, I can see which way this is going. And I went to bed, woke up the next morning, and I found out by logging into Facebook And okay, I know I can't swear on YouTube, but just one person literally just their Facebook status just went, "Oh," and
Yeah.
like, okay, I know what's happened here.
Yeah, but at least you had a feeling as to what was happening when he went to sleep. The people I really feel sorry for are the people who heard Farage's concession, went to sleep thinking everything was okay, and woke up in a parallel universe. You actually wonder if you were on a really bad trip or something when you woke up.
It's why I was determined to stay up for the Trump result, which I did duly, and that was quite a night.
It was, but I have to admit that one I did expect. By that stage, having seen how things had gone on the Brexit vote and feeling the same sort of dynamism and direction there, I was hopeful he wouldn't win, but I was resigned to the fact that he was going to win there. But I guess at the end of the day, a Trump is only for 4 years, a Brexit is for life, which does make it rather different.
Oh, it was surreal, the Trump night. I was watching it in a bar where there were literally, and this was in Britain, I should add. I wasn't in the States. I was in Britain, where there were people turning up with US flag capes and MAGA hats on. And this is in Britain.
I don't know what bars you go to, James, but let me know, so next time in Manchester I can avoid them.
But yeah, but then it took, of course, nearly 4 years for Brexit to actually happen. 2017 election came and went. It did. That was the one occasion where we had an exit poll where you really could not tell from the exit poll where it was going to end up, because literally 3 seats one direction and Theresa May would have been out, 7 seats in another direction and she'd have been a Klingon. Yeah, there was a time at which it looked like it was going to be another 74, wasn't it? Like two general elections in a year. And
yeah,
who knows? I mean, Corbyn could have won that second election.
Oh, he could.
Not with a majority, no, but...
Well, I think Corbyn is a bit of a paradox, really, because if you look at his performance as leader of the Labour Party, it's almost like the first half of his leadership, he almost played a blinder. I mean, the way he turned around the 2017 election was amazing. And then he just allowed all tactical advantage to erode away slowly by doing nothing, it seems, from 2017 to 2019 and losing all the momentum and power that he had.
I think, honestly, hubris got to him after the 2017 election. I think that's a lot of it. Right. I think there are a lot of his supporters, who saw, after that result, thought a Corbyn government was inevitable, and then, of course, the anti-Semitism crisis came. Well, it had already started, but then he handled that poorly.
That was awful. Yeah. To me, at that point, he did have the tactical ability to maneuver Parliament in the direction he needed to. He failed to utilise it. And of course, you add to that the presence of Jo Swinson, who also thought she was tactically invincible in terms of what she was doing in the Commons. And those two individuals' lack of ability to cooperate with each other is really one of the poorest examples of political failure I think we've seen for a long time.
I just remember that, it's going to go well when it's on the side of a bus, that the Lib Dem campaign bus in 2019 just had Jo Swinson's face on it,
That I didn't recall. Were the Tories driving it around marginal constituencies?
Well, yes. She started out thinking she was going to be the greatest asset for the Lib Dems campaign, and she turned out to be its greatest liability in the end. But
she did, unfortunately, which is a bit of a shame, because I do think deep down Jo Swinson was quite a decent person. But
I dare say,
advice, and I think sometimes the problem with opposition party leaders is they're surrounded by people who tell them exactly what they want to hear and keep them in this sort of cotton wool environment, telling them, oh, everyone's behind you, this is cutting through, this is cutting through. And nobody really says to them, look, you made yourself look foolish when you did this. You need to turn it around. And I think that's a bit of a shame. People often say to me, why don't you just join the Liberal Democrats? They're fairly pro-EU. Why don't you just put your lot in there? And my answer has to be, because you can never tell what they're going to do. I mean, obviously we had the coalition where some of the policies the Liberal Democrats backed were horrific. The complete U-turn on tuition fees as well is, I mean, I know a lot of politicians try to back out of promises they made, but not ones that they've signed as personal pledges before going into an election. And then, of course, last year we had the London elections. And I'll be honest, we weren't standing any candidates on the constituency. And so I was, or should I not vote? Should I vote Green? Should I vote Lib Dem? And in the end, I did vote Green in Barnet. And then to see the Greens and the Lib Dems put the Tories in office on the London Assembly, chairing all the committees and lock Labour out, I'm thinking, well, I can't vote for these people again, not until, there's some, you hear this, oh, we want to get the Tories out. And yet still, even after Sean Bailey's disgrace, they've now put another Tory as chair of the crime and the Police and Crime Committee in London. And I'm thinking, well, what do these people stand for? And I really wish the Lib Dems would get a great leader that would just knock them into shape a bit. I really do.
Yeah. I mean, the one Lib Dem leader I actually, in spite of his, there's one very obvious black spot on his record, but it was Tim Farron.
You're edging towards Tim Farron, aren't you?
Yes.
Yes. I have to admit, I thought the Lib Dems had turned a corner with Tim Farron because Tim Farron was one of the few Lib Dems who stood up and said, no, I'm not going to support the government on tuition fees. We signed a pledge not to do this. So we need to honour those pledges. And then, of course, he was replaced by Cable, who supported it, Swinson, who supported it, and now Ed Davey, another one who signed the piece of paper, broke the pledge, and is leader of the Liberal Democrats. And when you've got, let's be frank, we have a liar as Prime Minister. We have a total liar as Prime Minister. Now, if you are going to call out a total liar, when you yourself signed a pledge that you then lied about when you got into Parliament, it knocks your credibility. And that's why I think the Lib Dems really do need to move in. They need to move on, rather. They need to get past this era of people that betrayed the public in a general election and put someone in charge that we can trust.
100%. I mean, I get why the Lib Dems went for Ed Davey, but personally, if I were a Lib Dem member, I'd have voted for Layla Moran last year, or whenever it was. Was it 2020? Well, last year? Yeah, 2020. But yeah.
I think the reason they voted for Ed Davey is it's similar to why the Democrats selected Hillary Clinton in the US. You lost out last time. It's your turn this time, love, isn't it? And that is not a way to select a candidate. There is a reason that Ed Davey did not win against Joe Swinson. And those reasons hadn't gone away when he decided to stand again against Layla Moran. But I do agree with you. I think Layla Moran would have been a no baggage candidate with very, very strong pro-EU credentials. And I don't think she'd be saying things like, oh, the Lib Dems, we're not a Rejoin Party. Which of course immediately alienates lots and lots of voters, some of whom may hold their nose to vote Lib Dems, but they're not going to do it with any enthusiasm. I have to say, one of the reasons our party exists is, well, a bit of selfishness on my part, really. I literally have no one I can vote for. And to me, it's always been a case of, yes, I understand tactical voting. It was a happy coincidence in the last few years that the Labour Party, certainly in 2015, 17 and 19, were both the challenger in my marginal Tory Labour seat and had policies I could respect and vote for in all three cases. But now, I don't know who I can vote for. I can't vote for Labour because this make Brexit work, there's no substance behind it. I have no idea what they mean by making Brexit work, because Brexit was essentially a xenophobic proposition in the first place. So what are you saying when you say we're going to make Brexit work? Is it nudge, nudge, wink, wink? We know what you meant when you voted Brexit. We know what these foreigners are like, that sort of thing. Is that the subliminal message? I'm not voting for that. And I'm certainly not going to vote for
I think that is what they're going for, to be honest. I don't think they're actively racist. I just think Keir Starmer is sacrificing everything on the altar of trying to win over middle England swing voters. Yes. Sacrificing everything else on the altar of trying to get that quite limited demographic, frankly. Yeah. But he's just, I think the people advising him are just living in the 90s still. They really are.
I think you might be right. Well, the 90s was actually quite a good place to live in retrospect, now I come to think of it.
Yeah.
But let's project forward. Let's say Keir Starmer's right. And let's say Keir Starmer's right. The opinion polls, I know they've moved back a little bit towards the Tories this week, but let's even go for last week, where the opinion polls would have put Labour right on the edge, but not quite over in terms of having a majority government. What would we get in Parliament? We'd have a weak Labour government that doesn't have a majority, that is prey to any right-winger or left-winger in the Labour Party that wants to derail the agenda. We're not going to get any progress towards maintaining our links with the EU and improving them. We're not going to get any progress towards PR unless there's a major revolution at next year's party conference. We're going to get 5 years of weak, dithering Labour government that doesn't achieve anything, followed by a resurgent Tory party back in control of the country, foisting us even further in the right. I just hope that whoever is leading them at that stage is not as incompetent as the current incumbent.
Absolutely. But yes, that brings us forward to 2 years, 2020. Where were you? Because I can tell you where I was on the moment Brexit happened. I was there in Parliament Square. Oh yes, I showed up to Nigel Farage's Brexit party just to see what it was like.
Did you have fun?
Not really.
No, I can't imagine that would have been. I'll be honest with you. I think I just went to sleep early that night. It's not something to me, the moment was the referendum back in 2016. And then obviously there's been a few highs and lows since then in terms of trying to change the direction. The 31st of January 2020 was an utter irrelevance, really. I think one of the things that I did think shortly afterwards, though, was obviously that's when COVID was starting to become a real issue. And we as an island obviously had the ability to shut down firm, hard and fast very, very quickly. And although I hope that's what we were going to do, I remember thinking, oh goodness, the Brexiters will build this as a success because we controlled our borders and could do it. Now, obviously, the government made a complete mess of it. Nothing to do with Brexit, because let's be frank, if we'd had Jeremy Corbyn in power at the time, who I think would have taken the health of the nation a little bit more seriously than Boris Johnson, but he certainly wouldn't have gone off for a holiday in February 2020, leaving the chaos to just unravel. I think we'd have had a far better result as a result, not just in terms of Brexit, but in terms of controlling the virus, keeping our ports locked down, keeping it out of the UK to give enough time to actually develop the vaccines and the processes of it. And I think we'd see a lot less deaths than the 160,000 that we've had as a result of that.
I mean, a couple of tens of thousands of deaths were going to be inevitable to an extent.
Sadly, yes.
Sadly, I mean, I wouldn't wish it on. You know, any one of those deaths was one too many. At the same time, reality bites. A lot of deaths were going to be inevitable. At the same time, when you compare it to a country like Japan and compare our average death to them, given the population density and relative comparison in geographic size and position, it's very damning.
It is. And because a lot of people, I've had this argument with people before about Japan. They, oh no, Japan's twice the size of the UK. They were much more able to move than an island of our size. So, okay, what about New Zealand? Oh no, New Zealand was far too small. So what New Zealand did, they could only do because they're a small country. So the argument seems to have been larger countries than ours had a natural advantage. So did smaller countries than ours. There's some sort of magic formula that makes our country uniquely unable to do that. And that's the argument I find hardest to swallow. And of course, it's I'm quite aware in saying this that you know, there's a lot of people who have been devastated by COVID, far, far worse than has affected certainly myself or my family. And it's something I think we have to be very sensitive to. But at the same time, you also have to look at the cold, hard facts. And the cold, hard facts were this government took its eye off the ball in February 2020. It acted in an appallingly incompetent way in the first few months. And many, many people have had to pay the price for that since.
But I think that's all we have time for in this segment. Thank you very much, Rich, for joining. That was a spirited discussion for sure. And I'm sure we'll be seeing you again soon. Now, 2022 marks 70 years since Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the British throne. This makes her the longest serving monarch in United Kingdom history, having already surpassed the previous record holder, Queen Victoria, back in 2015. But with this milestone comes many questions about the future of the monarchy. It's easy to forget that Elizabeth II is not just the Queen of the United Kingdom, but also of more than a dozen Commonwealth realms that were formerly part of the British Empire. Last year, Barbados became the most recent one of those countries to walk away from monarchy and become a republic. Could more follow in Barbados' footsteps in due course? I'm joined today by Sandy Biar of the Australian Republican Movement, who's here to discuss Australia's past, present, and future relationship with the Crown. Sandy, how's it going?
Very well. How are you going?
Not too bad at all. Slight time difference, as you can probably tell from the shades of our backgrounds, but here we have it. Okay.
Yeah, you've been very, very accommodating, James. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so as I just said, it's Jubilee year this year. What's the hype like in Australia? Is it something that's getting much attention over at your end?
Look, not very much. The government has tried to build it up and create a bit of hype around it, but it ranks as probably a 30 rank issue in Australia, I would say, at the moment. And certainly, I mean, we had government buildings lit up in purple a couple of weeks back, and I think most people missed it. But that was about the extent of the recognition of that milestone here, with a tiny bit of media coverage. So, I mean, we commissioned some research last year that actually found that only 36% of Australians know that the Queen is actually Australia's head of state. And despite the fact that she's been on the throne, the Australian throne even, for 70 years. And so for many Australians, they're not even aware that the Queen is our head of state. And that's one of the challenges that we've got as a campaign for change, to actually get out there and explain what our current system of government is and why we think it's time that we moved on and had our own head of state.
Well, every country has a different reason for wanting to abolish the monarchy. So, for example, with Barbados, that was tied in with the history of slavery and colonialism. What's the case for Australia abolishing the monarchy then?
Well, I think it simply comes down to every independent, self-respecting country should have one of its own citizens at the head of its country. And there may be a time, if we go back 120 or 150 years ago, when most Australians saw themselves as British first and Australian second, but that time has long since passed. And Australians today overwhelmingly see themselves as Australians. We have Australians come from all different corners of the world. And so in terms of our modern nation today, our multicultural nation, the British monarchy simply can't represent Australians anymore. And many would argue he is very much the icon of Britain. And certainly Australians see themselves as different to the UK and separate to the UK and independent of the UK. So as an independent country, we should have one of our own citizens as our head of state.
Of course, back in the 1990s, of course, there was a referendum on abolishing the monarchy in Australia. It didn't pass, albeit by a narrow margin. Why did that happen? What was the reason why Australia rejected a republic beforehand? And what's changed now?
Well, the polls at the time actually showed that there was majority support for Australia becoming a republic, for an Australian republic. And the challenge at the time was very much about finding that common agreement about what would replace our current system of government in terms of what changes would actually need to be made. In 1999, they proposed that the Parliament, by a 2/3 majority, would choose who our head of state is. That would be the Prime Minister nominates to the Parliament a candidate, and then the Parliament signs off on that. That at the time, that was actually quite an unpopular approach. And the polls leading up to that referendum showed that there wasn't going to be enough public support for that referendum to pass. The referendum threshold in Australia for changing our constitution is a really high one. It's not simply an advisory vote. It's actually mandated in our constitution that it needs to be a majority of the vote nationally, as well as 4 out of 6 of our states need to pass that. So a majority of states need to have a majority in their own jurisdictions, for that change to happen. So it's quite a high threshold. Only 8 of 44 proposals for constitutional change have succeeded in Australia. It's a higher level of support than any of our major parties need to even govern the country. And so there's a high threshold there that needs to be reached. And so that's why recently we announced an alternative model and a different approach for Australia to become a republic, and that could be put forward to a referendum. One of the challenges in the lead up to the 99 campaign and during that campaign was that Australians overwhelmingly said that they wanted to vote for who the head of state was. And the proposal that was being put forward last time didn't allow them to do that. So what we proposed this time around is where all Australians would get a chance to vote from a short list of candidates that had been put forward and nominated by Australia's parliaments right across the country. So then they can choose who they want to represent them as head of state. And that's a really important step forward so that Australians will finally have a head of state who can represent them.
Obviously, there's a general election coming up in Australia this year. Could be up for a change of government. Current opinion polling is suggesting that the Labour Party, which of course has an official policy of republicanism, could be in with a chance of winning. Does this make you feel optimistic?
Well, look, there's actually strong support among both major parties for Australia to become a republic. And so the challenge for us as a campaign is to make sure that that gets back on the agenda and that we work with those supporters in Parliament. So at the moment, we have in Australia, there's 2 houses of Parliament. There's the House of Representatives, the lower house from which the government is formed, and the Senate, an elected upper house. And at the moment, 60% of both houses support Australia becoming a republic. Yes, the Labor Party, the Federal Labor Party has a position in favour of a republic, as do the Australian Greens. On the coalition side, so in Australia, there's the Liberal Party and the National Party. Among Liberals, there are twice as many Liberals that support a republic than oppose a republic in the federal parliament. And so these are really heartening numbers for us, but the challenge is to build that consensus around the proposal about the way forward and to get it on the agenda. And so that's why we've been scaling up our campaign in recent years to bring in tens of thousands of new Australians into the campaign, so we can start to apply that pressure, get it back on the agenda and have that conversation.
Are you anticipating it being a big talking point during the upcoming election campaign? Or do you see it more likely being shadowed by other issues?
Well, there's a lot going on around Australia and across the world at the moment that are likely to, other issues that are likely to probably steal the limelight, from this. But we'll be working hard to get as much attention on it as possible. And certainly we recognise that this is a longer term campaign. It will take some time before Australians feel comfortable and informed about making the decision we're asking them to make. And so we recognise that this is going to take a number of years to get back to having another national vote. And so we want to make sure that when that opportunity arises, when the political agreement is there, that there's the support there across the Australian community for that referendum to pass.
A lot of critics of the idea of republic might say it would be good to have an apolitical head of state, be good to have a constitutional monarch that might be complementary to a democracy, to a parliamentary democracy. What would you say to that criticism?
I'd say that the idea of hereditary rule, where a position in society is passed down from one generation to the next of one particular family, where people don't get to choose who that person is, where there's no democratic accountability, I'd say that monarchy and democracy are at opposite ends of the spectrum, and that in a modern society, in a society that prides itself on equality, on equal opportunity, on people having a say about how their country is run and participating as citizens, that monarchy is completely inappropriate in a modern democracy like Australia or even like the UK. And so I certainly don't believe that a constitutional monarchy or monarchy in general contributes to Australian democracy. I see that as a natural tension, and I think the history of the UK shows that tension where between the monarch and the parliament, and over time, history has erred towards greater democracy in places like the UK, and Australia's inherited that tradition as well. And so this really is the natural next step in Australia's evolution as a country, to do away with the monarchy and make sure that we've got democracy from the top right through our system of government.
Of course, Barbados became the latest Commonwealth realm to move away from monarchy last year. How did you react to that news?
Well, look, it's always nice to see another member of the Commonwealth become a republic. At the moment, that leaves only 15 of 54 Commonwealth countries, with the Queen as head of state. And so Barbados joins the overwhelming majority of Commonwealth nations who are already republics. And look, we'd love to see Australia join those ranks of Commonwealth republics soon too. And that's what we're working hard to get to.
And of course, one of the big questions that often comes up, what about the flag? Is the flag going to change when the Queen goes?
Well, we see that as
when the monarch goes, whoever it may be at the time.
We see that as a very separate issue. The question about our flag is another question of symbols and whether or not that represents us as a nation. There's a variety of views within our ranks as to that question and across Australian society, but we're really focused on Australia becoming a republic and those reforms. We think that those are the most important ones to pursue and the ones that really matter in this respect. And I should say, in relation to your last question about Barbados as well, we really showed that countries who do become a republic can not only stay in the Commonwealth, but have a really amicable ongoing relationship with the UK, but also even with the Crown. So with Prince Charles, for instance, attending the very ceremony at which Barbados became a republic, it's a good example of how it doesn't in any way need to be disrespectful separation, but it can be actually a new revitalized relationship between those countries and the Crown and the UK. Look, there's only positives to this change, absolutely no negatives, and so we're working hard to get out there and make the case for that.
In all likelihood, what would you see as a likely time frame for this transition towards a republic? Are we looking at it happening within the current Queen's lifetime, or are you looking at something far more long term?
Well, that's the thing about hereditary rule. We don't know how long the Queen will live for. We don't know how long the Queen's reign will go for. She could live as long as her mother, for instance. And it could still have quite a way to go. But look, the important thing is that as a country, we're ready to make this change on our terms. We're an independent country. The Queen has always acknowledged that and said that this is a matter and a decision for the Australian people to make for ourselves. And so that's why we're getting out there and having this conversation with the broader Australian community, and making sure, again, when the opportunity comes to make that change, that Australians feel comfortable and informed about that change.
Sandy, thanks very much for your time.
Appreciate it. Thanks very much, James.